In 1882, a German philosopher sat in a rented room in Genoa and wrote the words "God is dead," knowing full well that he was not announcing a death, but diagnosing one that had already occurred. The question was not whether meaning had collapsed, but what human beings would do in the ruins. Tonight, we will trace nihilism from its misunderstood origins through its darkest expressions and into its surprising transformations. We will meet the thinkers who named the void, those who stared into it without flinching, and those who asked whether emptiness might be the beginning rather than the end. This is not a philosophy of despair, though despair runs through it. This is the story of what happens when certainty crumbles and human beings must decide what, if anything, to build in its place. The word itself arrives in Western consciousness through an unlikely route. A Russian novel published in 1862, Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, introduced the character Bazarov, a young medical student who rejected everything his parents' generation held sacred. Art was useless. Tradition was chains. Romantic love was chemical reaction. Authority deserved only contempt. Turgenev gave this attitude a name borrowed from Latin, nihilism, from nihil, meaning nothing. Within a decade, the term had escaped the pages of fiction and become a political accusation, a generational diagnosis, a spectre haunting the drawing rooms of Europe. But what Turgenev had identified as youthful rebellion, Friedrich Nietzsche would recognize as something far more profound, the inevitable consequence of 2,000 years of Western metaphysics eating its own foundations. Nietzsche had watched it happen in real time. Born in 1844 in the Prussian village of Rücken, the son and grandson of Lutheran pastors, he had been trained for the church before discovering philology, ancient languages, the Greeks. By 24, he was a professor at Basel. By 35, he had abandoned academia entirely, wandering from Swiss boarding houses to Italian coastal towns, writing in cheap rented rooms with terrible eyesight and worse health. And everywhere he looked, he saw the same thing. European civilization had built itself on a foundation of absolute values, divine command, transcendent meaning, and that foundation was crumbling. Not because anyone had decided to tear it down, but because the very tools Christianity had given the West, reason and honesty above all, had turned against their source. If you subject every claim to rational scrutiny, eventually you must subject the claim that God exists to that same scrutiny, and if you value truth above comfort, you cannot look away from what you find. The Gay Science, published in 1882, contains the parable that would define Nietzsche's legacy. A madman runs into a marketplace in the bright morning hours, lighting a lantern, and crying that he is looking for God. The people in the marketplace laugh at him. They have already stopped believing in God, so what is he searching for? But the madman turns on them with terrible clarity. God is dead, he tells them. We have killed him. And they do not yet understand what they have done. They do not understand that when you remove the sun from the center of the cosmos, everything that depended on that sun for light and warmth is cast into darkness and cold. All of morality, all of meaning, all of value, every claim that this matters and that does not, every insistence that you ought to do this rather than that, all of it had been anchored in the conviction that reality itself was structured by purpose, by divine intention, by a moral order that transcended human preference. Without that anchor, everything drifts. This was nihilism, not a philosophy anyone chose, but an event everyone would have to survive. Yet Nietzsche saw something the madman's audience did not. He saw that nihilism could be passive or active. Passive nihilism was exhaustion, resignation, the slow decay into meaninglessness. It was the last man, as he would describe him in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the creature who had made everything small and safe and comfortable, who no longer believed in anything enough to risk anything, who blinked and said that he had invented happiness. Active nihilism, by contrast, was destructive force turned creative. It was the recognition that if the old values were dead, then human beings were finally free to create new ones, not by discovering what the universe demanded, but by deciding what they themselves would affirm. This was dangerous freedom. It came with no guarantees. It required courage of a kind most people did not possess. But it was, Nietzsche believed, the only honest response to the situation history had produced. Nihilism, then, is not what most people think it is. It is not teenage angst or fashionable pessimism or an excuse for cruelty. It is a diagnosis of a historical condition, the moment when a culture loses its ability to believe in the stories that once gave it coherence, and it is more than a historical curiosity. We live in its aftermath still, perhaps more acutely than Nietzsche's own contemporaries did. Every time someone asks what the point of anything is, every time someone confronts the absence of cosmic justice or inherent purpose, every time someone wonders whether morality is just preference dressed up in imperatives, they are standing in the space nihilism opened. The question is not whether nihilism is true. The question is what follows from it, and whether human beings can build something durable on ground that offers no guarantees. The story of nihilism begins long before Nietzsche, and it continues long after him. It winds through the pessimistic metaphysics of Arthur Schopenhauer, who saw the universe as blind will grinding toward nothing. It explodes in the revolutionary politics of 19th century Russia, where young radicals took the word nihilism and turned it into a banner. It reappears in the ontological investigations of Martin Heidegger, who asked what nothing itself might be. It confronts the existentialists, who tried to turn the absence of given meaning into the ground of radical freedom. It seeps into literature, into Samuel Beckett's minimalist stages and Emile Cioran's corrosive aphorisms. It raises questions that philosophy still struggles to answer: whether moral truth exists, whether knowledge is possible, whether meaning can be made or only discovered. And it forces us to decide what kind of life is worth living when the universe itself offers no guidance. But to understand how nihilism became philosophy rather than mere rebellion, we must turn to the word itself, to its origins and early uses, to the distinction between what it actually means and what people fear it means. The word itself comes from the Latin fage nihila, meaning nothing, not the nothing of an empty room or a blank page, but the nothing of absolute negation, the nothing that stands against something and says, this does not exist, this has no ground, this means precisely zero. The Latin fage nihila shares roots with older negations, the Sanskrit fajna and the Greek fajamuk, those small sounds that reverse and refuse. Every language needs a way to say no, to mark absence, to indicate what is not there. But nihilism goes further than simple negation. It does not merely say no to this or that particular thing. It says no to the whole structure of meaning, the entire framework within which things could be said to matter at all. The term böse nihilism itself appears sporadically in European philosophy before the 19th century, mostly as a term of abuse. In the late 1700s, German philosophers used böse nihilism to describe positions that denied religious or moral truth. It was not a self-description but an accusation, the kind of word you used for a position so extreme that merely naming it was enough to dismiss it. Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi used it to attack Fichte's idealism, claiming that any philosophy which denied objective reality outside consciousness inevitably collapsed into nothingness. The word carried the smell of danger, of thought that had gone too far and fallen into an abyss from which no recovery was possible. But nihilism as a cultural force, as something more than a philosophical insult, emerged most vividly in Russia in the 1860s, and it was not philosophers who gave it life, but novelists and critics, young radicals who seized the word and wore it proudly. Ivan Turgenev published Our Fathers and Sons in 1862, and in its pages appeared Bazarov, a character who would define nihilism for a generation. Bazarov is a medical student, a materialist, a man who believes in science and nothing else. He rejects art, romance, traditional manners, and all appeals to sentiment or inherited authority. When asked what he believes in, he answers with one word: nothing. When asked what a nihilist is, another character explains that a nihilist is a person who does not bow down before any authority, who does not accept any principle on faith, no matter how much respect surrounds that principle. Turgenev did not invent the term, but he gave it a face and a voice. Bazarov became a template, both celebrated and condemned. Young Russians saw themselves in him, in his refusal to accept the world as their parents had received it. They admired his commitment to reason over tradition, his willingness to tear down structures that no longer served any purpose beyond their own perpetuation. They liked that he was rude, that he did not perform the rituals of deference that held Tsarist society together. But older Russians saw Bazarov as a threat, as the embodiment of a destructive impulse that would unravel everything civilization had built. Turgenev himself was ambivalent. He gave Bazarov intelligence and integrity, but he also gave him a death that suggested limits to pure negation. The novel does not resolve whether Bazarov represents liberation or catastrophe. It simply presents him and lets readers choose. What the Russian nihilists actually believed was not metaphysical despair, but political and social rejection. They were not claiming that life was meaningless, or that existence itself was void. They were rejecting specific structures of authority: the Orthodox Church, the autocracy, the aristocracy, the sentimental culture that aestheticized suffering while doing nothing to alleviate it. Dmitry Pisarev, the most radical of the nihilist critics, argued for a ruthless utilitarianism. Art was valuable only if it served social progress. Philosophy mattered only if it contributed to human welfare. Anything that could not justify itself through practical benefit should be discarded. This was not cosmic despair. This was a program aggressive and confident in its own clarity. The Russian nihilists were materialists who believed in science, in reason, in the possibility of remaking society on rational grounds. They rejected romanticism not because they thought nothing mattered, but because they thought romanticism distracted people from what actually mattered: food, shelter, education, justice, the material conditions of human life. They were closer to utilitarians or positivists than to the existential nihilists of the 20th century. They believed in causation, in natural law, in the possibility of knowledge. What they did not believe in was inherited tradition, aesthetic mysticism, or the moral authority of institutions that existed only to preserve their own power. But this distinction was lost on much of Europe. Western observers saw the word nihilism, saw the violence and radicalism associated with Russian revolutionary movements, and concluded that nihilism meant destruction for its own sake, a kind of philosophical vandalism that reveled in tearing things down without offering anything to replace them. The term became synonymous with terrorism, with assassination plots, with bomb-throwing anarchists who wanted to burn the world. It became a word that respectable society used to mark the boundary of acceptable thought, the point beyond which lay only madness and violence. This was partly caricature, and partly a genuine failure to distinguish between different kinds of negation. The Russian nihilists rejected particular structures of authority, not existence itself. They had positive commitments to science, to equality, to rational social organization. But because they rejected so much of what European culture considered sacred, they appeared to reject everything. The distinction between nihilism as a political stance and nihilism as a metaphysical position became hopelessly blurred. The word accumulated connotations: godlessness, immorality, despair, violence, the collapse of all standards, the end of meaning itself. By the time the 1880s arrived, nihilism had become a term of fear and misunderstanding. It named something that threatened not just particular governments or social arrangements, but the entire structure of value and significance that made civilization possible. It suggested a future in which nothing could be believed, nothing trusted, nothing held sacred. It pointed toward a world in which human beings, unmoored from all authority and tradition, would drift into either chaos or cruelty. The word had transformed from a description of a specific Russian radical movement into a diagnosis of a deeper crisis, one that was not limited to Russia and was not primarily about politics at all. What had begun as a rejection of particular authorities had opened a question that philosophy could not ignore. If we reject inherited values, if we refuse to accept anything on the grounds of tradition or faith alone, what remains? If we insist that every principle justify itself through reason or utility, and if reason itself cannot finally ground its own authority, where does justification end? The Russian nihilists thought they knew it ended in science, in material progress, in the rational organization of society for human welfare, but others suspected that the process of negation, once begun, would not stop so conveniently, that it would continue until it consumed even the grounds on which the nihilists themselves stood. But to understand how nihilism became philosophy rather than mere rebellion, we must turn to the thinker who saw it not as youthful posturing, but as the defining crisis of Western civilization itself. But to understand how nihilism became philosophy rather than mere rebellion, we must turn to the thinker who saw it not as youthful posturing, but as the defining crisis of Western civilization itself. Friedrich Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the Prussian village of Rücken, the son of a Lutheran pastor, who died when the boy was only 5 years old. This early encounter with death and the rituals of Christian mourning would shadow everything Nietzsche later wrote. He was brilliant, precocious, and by the age of 24 had been appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, an almost unheard of achievement. But chronic illness plagued him, forcing his resignation after only a decade, and he spent the rest of his productive life wandering between rented rooms in Switzerland, Italy, and France, writing books that almost no one read during his lifetime. In January of 1889, he collapsed on a street in Turin, reportedly after seeing a horse being beaten. He never recovered his sanity and died 11 years later in Weimar, leaving behind a body of work that would reshape Western philosophy, even as it was distorted beyond recognition by those who claimed to understand it. When Nietzsche wrote the words "God is dead," he was not celebrating, he was not announcing a recent event, he was diagnosing something that had already happened, something that European culture had not yet fully comprehended. The phrase appears most famously in a parable from the Gay Science, published in 1882. A madman runs into a marketplace in the bright morning hours, carrying a lantern and crying out, "I seek God, I seek God." The people around him, many of them atheists and skeptics themselves, laugh at his urgency. "Have you lost him?" They mock. "Has he gotten lost like a child?" But the madman turns on them with terrible intensity. "Where is God?" he shouts. "I will tell you, we have killed him. You and I, all of us are his murderers." What follows is not triumphant but horrified. The madman speaks of unhinging the earth from its sun, of wiping away the entire horizon with a sponge, of falling continuously in all directions. The death of God is not liberation but catastrophe, a cosmic unmooring. And the most unsettling part of the parable is that the madman has come too early. The people in the marketplace do not understand what he is saying because they have not yet grasped what their own disbelief means. They think they can simply stop believing in God and continue as before, with the same values, the same moralities, the same sense of purpose. But Nietzsche saw that this was impossible. God was not merely one belief among others. God was the guarantor of meaning itself, the foundation on which all Western values had been built. With that foundation gone, everything erected upon it must eventually collapse. This is what Nietzsche meant by nihilism. It was not a philosophy one chooses, but an event, a historical process that European civilization was undergoing whether it acknowledged it or not. The Enlightenment had wielded reason like a weapon against superstition and dogma, and that weapon had done its work too well. Christianity had taught Europe to value truth above all else, to be intellectually honest, to question received wisdom. And when that habit of questioning turned inward, when it examined the foundations of Christianity itself, it found them wanting. Faith could not withstand the scrutiny it had taught people to practice. In this sense, Christianity had created the conditions for its own obsolescence. It had trained generations of Europeans to seek truth relentlessly, and the truth they found was that there was no God, no divine order, no cosmic purpose, only a universe indifferent to human concerns. Nietzsche distinguished between what he called passive nihilism and active nihilism, though these terms appear more clearly in his notebooks than in his published works. Passive nihilism is exhaustion, resignation, the weariness that comes from recognizing that nothing matters. It is Buddhism, Schopenhauer, the desire to escape from a world drained of meaning. Active nihilism, by contrast, is destructive energy, the the will to tear down old values precisely because they have been exposed as hollow. It is violent, even gleeful in its negation, but it clears ground. And beyond both of these, Nietzsche envisioned something else, though he struggled to name it clearly, a way of living that accepts the death of God without despair, that creates values knowing they have no cosmic sanction, that says yes to existence even in its meaninglessness. This is why Nietzsche saw nihilism as both crisis and opportunity. The crisis was real and unavoidable. European civilization was built on Christian metaphysics, on the belief in a world beyond this one, in absolute moral truths, in progress towards some divine purpose. When those beliefs crumbled, so too would the entire structure of meaning, morality, and motivation they had supported. Nietzsche predicted that the 20th century would be the most catastrophic in human history precisely because of this crisis, and he was not wrong. But he also believed that this catastrophe could be the beginning of something new. If human beings could accept that they alone create meaning, that values are human inventions rather than divine revelations, they might become what he called the overman, not a biological superman, but a human being who lives fully and creatively in a world without transcendent purpose. The tragedy is that Nietzsche himself never achieved this. His late letters, written in the months before his collapse, grow increasingly grandiose and fragmented. He signed some of them Dionysus, or the Crucified. His sister Elizabeth, an anti-Semite and German nationalist, would later take control of his literary estate and distort his work to serve the very ideologies he had despised. The Nazis would claim him as a prophet, ignoring his contempt for nationalism and racial thinking. And for decades, readers would struggle to separate Nietzsche's actual philosophy from the grotesque caricature that history had made of it. But if you return to the gay science, to that image of the madman with his lantern in the marketplace, what you find is not celebration but a kind of awful honesty. Nietzsche was not pleased that God was dead. He was terrified of what would follow, and he was trying to warn anyone who would listen that the real consequences had not yet begun. The laughter in the marketplace would eventually turn to horror. The ground was already shifting beneath everyone's feet. Yet Nietzsche did not arrive at this diagnosis from nowhere. He stood in a philosophical lineage that had already questioned the foundations of meaning and value, beginning with a profoundly pessimistic predecessor. Arthur Schopenhauer was not a pleasant man. Born in 1788 to a wealthy merchant family in Danzig, he spent much of his adult life nursing grievances, avoiding human contact, and writing philosophy that concluded the universe was worse than worthless. He ate alone. He trusted no one. He kept a poodle for company and named it, with deliberate irony, Atman, the Hindu term for the universal soul. When he died in 1860, he left behind a philosophical system so bleak, so uncompromising in its rejection of optimism, that it became the unavoidable starting point for anyone attempting to think seriously about meaninglessness in the modern age. Nietzsche would call him his educator. Wagner would set his pessimism to music, but Schopenhauer himself wanted no followers. He wanted only to tell the truth as he saw it, regardless of how unwelcome that truth might be. The truth, as Schopenhauer understood it, began with a simple observation borrowed from Immanuel Kant. The world we experience through our senses is not the world as it truly is. Colors, sounds, shapes, the passage of time itself, all of these are products of how our minds organize raw sensation. Behind this realm of appearance, Kant had posited a realm of things in themselves, forever inaccessible to human knowledge. Schopenhauer accepted this division, but made one crucial modification. He claimed we could know the thing in itself after all, not through outward observation, but through inward experience. When you feel hunger, desire, fear, or pain, you are not perceiving something filtered through the mind's categories. You are experiencing reality directly, and what you experience is will, not your individual will, not conscious choice, but a vast, blind, directionless striving that constitutes the inner nature of everything that exists. This will is not rational. It has no purpose, no goal, no plan. It simply is an endless wanting without object, a ceaseless churning that produces the entire phenomenal world as its expression. A stone falls because will expresses itself as gravity. A plant grows because will expresses itself as life. An animal hunts because will expresses itself as hunger. And a human being suffers because will, in achieving consciousness, becomes aware of its own perpetual dissatisfaction. We are the universe becoming conscious of its own pointless striving, and that consciousness is precisely what makes us miserable. Schopenhauer's masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818 when he was just 30 years old, elaborated this vision with relentless consistency. Suffering is not an accident or a problem to be solved. It is the fundamental condition of existence. Every desire satisfied gives way immediately to new desire. Every goal achieved reveals itself as empty. Pleasure is merely the temporary cessation of pain, never a positive state in itself. Even happiness, when examined honestly, turns out to be nothing more than the brief interval between wanting and wanting again. The will demands, and we obey, and the demanding never stops until death finally quiets it, at least in this particular manifestation. This might seem like simple pessimism, a gloomy temperament elevated to metaphysics, but Schopenhauer was doing something more philosophically radical. He was describing a universe fundamentally indifferent to human values, a cosmos in which suffering has no redemptive purpose because there is no purpose at all. Christianity had made suffering meaningful by framing it as punishment, test, or purification. Enlightenment optimism had promised that reason would eventually eliminate suffering through progress. Schopenhauer rejected both consolations. Suffering is built into the structure of reality because reality is will, and will is inherently lack in completeness, dissatisfaction. To exist is to want is to suffer. This is not a tragedy in the classical sense, because tragedy implies meaning. This is simply the way things are. And yet Schopenhauer did not conclude with suicide, though he acknowledged that suicide presented itself as an obvious question. His answer was borrowed from sources the European philosophical tradition had largely ignored. In his 20s, Schopenhauer had encountered translations of Hindu and Buddhist texts, particularly the Upanishads and accounts of Buddhist doctrine. He found in them a metaphysics that matched his own intuitions, a recognition that the self is illusion, that desire is the root of suffering, and that liberation comes through negation. But where Buddhism offered the possibility of enlightenment through practice and insight, Schopenhauer proposed something bleaker. We could quiet the will through aesthetic contemplation, where for brief moments we lose ourselves in beauty and forget the demands of wanting. We could practice asceticism, denying the will through deliberate renunciation, but complete escape was rare, perhaps impossible. The best we could hope for was temporary relief, brief windows where the will loosens its grip, and we experience something like peace. Young Friedrich Nietzsche encountered Schopenhauer's philosophy in 1865 at age 20, and it struck him with the force of revelation. Here was a thinker who refused comforting lies, who looked at existence without flinching, who treated philosophy as confrontation rather than consolation. Nietzsche devoured the world as will and representation, and emerged convinced he had found his teacher. For nearly a decade, Schopenhauer's influence saturated Nietzsche's thinking. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, attempted to understand Greek culture through Schopenhauerian categories, portraying art as the only adequate response to a meaningless, suffering-filled existence. But something shifted. By the late 1870s, Nietzsche began to see Schopenhauer not as liberator but as symptom, not as truth-teller but as the last gasp of a dying worldview. The pessimism that had seemed like courage now looked like retreat. The emphasis on negation, denial, and escape now appeared life-denying in the worst sense. Schopenhauer had seen the collapse of meaning and responded by trying to opt out of existence itself. Nietzsche wanted something else. He wanted to say yes to life despite its meaninglessness, to embrace becoming rather than flee into Buddhist nothingness. The question was whether such affirmation was possible without self-deception, whether one could stare into the same abyss Schopenhauer had described and respond with something other than resignation. This is why pessimism and nihilism, though related, diverge at a crucial point. Pessimism is an evaluation. It looks at existence and judges it negatively, finds it wanting, concludes it would be better if things were otherwise, or if nothing existed at all. Nihilism, at least in the form Nietzsche would develop, is not primarily an evaluation but a diagnosis. It names the collapse of all frameworks for evaluation itself. Schopenhauer still believed in the category of better and worse, even if he concluded that existence fell firmly on the worse side. Nietzsche would eventually question whether such categories had any foundation at all. Schopenhauer offered a metaphysics of suffering. Nietzsche would offer something stranger and more unsettling, a vision in which even suffering and joy lose their fixed meanings, where values themselves become historical artifacts rather than cosmic truths. If Schopenhauer provided the groundwork for thinking a universe without inherent purpose, the question became, what do human beings do when they recognize this truth? For some, the answer was not philosophy but action, not thought but refusal. While Schopenhauer and Nietzsche wrestled with metaphysics, a different kind of nihilism was taking shape 1,500 miles to the east. In the cramped editorial offices of St. Petersburg journals and the smoky rooms where young intellectuals gathered, nihilism meant something more immediate than the death of God. It meant the rejection of everything the previous generation held sacred: the authority of the Tsar, the teachings of the Orthodox Church, the sentimental idealism of romantic literature, and most fundamentally, the assumption that one should accept any inherited truth simply because it had always been accepted. Russian nihilism was not a meditation on meaninglessness, it was a program of demolition. The word itself entered Russian consciousness through Ivan Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons in 1862, but the phenomenon was already well underway. The young radicals of the 1860s, the so-called men of the 60s, approached inherited tradition with a surgeon's detachment and a revolutionary's impatience. They were not interested in whether values had cosmic grounding. They wanted to know whether those values served human liberation or merely propped up an oppressive social order. When they looked at autocracy, at serfdom, at the elaborate hierarchies of imperial Russia, they saw no divine mandate. They saw arbitrary power maintaining itself through myth. Dmitry Pisarev, who lived from 1840 to 1868, embodied this attitude with particular ferocity. A literary critic rather than a systematic philosopher, Pisarev wielded his pen like a weapon against everything he considered useless mystification. He attacked Pushkin, the beloved national poet, as a purveyor of empty aestheticism that distracted from real social problems. He dismissed romantic ideals of love and beauty as sentimental illusions that kept people passive. He championed a ruthless utilitarianism. If an idea or an institution could not be justified in terms of material human welfare, it should be destroyed. This was nihilism as clearing operation, making space for something new by burning away the accumulated debris of centuries. What distinguished Russian nihilism from its Western philosophical cousins was its fundamentally practical orientation. These were not scholars contemplating the void in academic comfort. Many were from the raznokhintsy, the class of educated commoners without noble rank, who had enough learning to see through official ideology, but no stake in preserving the existing order. For them, nihilism was not an abstract position, but a lived refusal. They cut their hair short and wore dark clothing to reject fashion. They formed communes to experiment with new social relations. They studied natural sciences because empirical knowledge seemed like a tool of liberation compared to religious dogma or literary sentimentality. They believed that human beings could be rational, that society could be rebuilt on scientific principles, that nothing should be accepted on faith or tradition alone. The great irony, which Pisarev himself seemed to recognize before his early death by drowning, was that this rejection of all inherited values was itself a kind of faith. It required believing that reason alone could guide human life, that material conditions determined consciousness, that tearing down the old would necessarily make space for something better. There was something almost religious in the fervor of these self-proclaimed destroyers of religion. Fyodor Dostoevsky watched this movement with fascination and horror. In novels written through the 1860s and 70s, particularly Crime and Punishment in 1866 and The Possessed in 1872, he explored what he saw as the terrifying logic of nihilism taken to its conclusion. If there is no God, if there are no objective moral values, if everything is permitted, then what prevents the strong from doing whatever they wish? His character Raskolnikov murders an old pawnbroker, partly as an experiment in living beyond conventional morality. His character Stavrogin in The Possessed embodies a kind of moral void, a man who has lost the capacity to believe in anything and consequently destroys everyone around him. Dostoevsky's response was not philosophical argument, but psychological demonstration. He showed, or tried to show, that human beings cannot actually live as nihilists without either going mad or discovering that they need something beyond mere negation. His novels were jingot, warnings that the rejection of traditional authority would not lead to liberation, but to chaos and suffering. Yet his portrayal of nihilists was so psychologically acute, so sympathetic in its understanding of why someone might embrace such a position, that the novels became more complex than simple condemnations. You can read them and understand both why nihilism attracts and why Dostoevsky feared it. Western Europe watched Russian nihilism with a mixture of fascination and misunderstanding. Reports filtered back of wild young radicals who believed in nothing, who wanted to destroy everything, who represented some terrifying new force. The actual complexity of Russian radical thought, its roots in specific social conditions, and its genuine concern with human welfare, often got lost in translation. What arrived in Western consciousness was a caricature, the nihilist as bomb-throwing anarchist, as moral monster, as symptom of Russian barbarism. This mythologized version bore little resemblance to someone like Pisarev, who spent more time writing literary criticism than plotting revolution. The difference between Russian and Western nihilism ran deeper than politics. When Nietzsche diagnosed nihilism, he was describing what he saw as the inevitable consequence of Christianity collapsing under the weight of its own truth-seeking. This was a metaphysical and cultural crisis affecting all of European civilization. When Russian radicals embraced nihilism, they were making a tactical choice about how to oppose specific forms of oppression. One was a diagnosis of modernity itself. The other was a strategy for social transformation. They used the same word, but they were often talking about different things. By the 1880s, the political energy of the men of the 60s had indeed dissipated. Some radicals turned to terrorism, assassinating Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Others retreated into quieter forms of opposition, or gave up entirely. The actual movement fragmented and evolved. But the questions it raised about authority and tradition, about whether inherited values deserve respect or require justification, about what happens when a generation decides to reject everything it was taught, these questions did not disappear. They would return in different forms, in different places, whenever certainty crumbled and the burden of creating meaning fell back onto human beings themselves. This political energy would eventually dissipate or transform into other movements, but the philosophical problem nihilism named would not disappear. It would intensify through the catastrophes of the 20th century, demanding new responses. While the Russian nihilists were dismantling social hierarchies and Dostoevsky was wrestling with their legacy in fiction, Western philosophy was about to encounter nihilism in a form so radical it would make previous confrontations seem almost quaint. The thinker who would transform nihilism from cultural diagnosis into fundamental ontology was not particularly interested in politics or social movements. Martin Heidegger cared about something he considered more primordial, the question of being itself, and why Western thought had spent 2,000 years forgetting to ask it properly. On July 24, 1929, Heidegger delivered his inaugural lecture as professor at the University of Freiburg. The title was deceptively modest. What is metaphysics? The question he posed was not modest at all. He asked his audience to consider nothing, not as mere absence or negation, but as something that acts. The nothing, Heidegger claimed, nothings. This peculiar formulation, this use of nothing as a verb, was not wordplay or mysticism. It was an attempt to articulate something philosophy had systematically overlooked, that nothing is not simply the opposite of something, not merely what remains when you subtract all beings from consideration, but rather an active phenomenon we encounter in certain profound moments of existence. Heidegger began with anxiety, that peculiar mood distinct from fear. When you fear something, you fear a particular thing, the oncoming car, the critical colleague, the medical diagnosis. Fear has an object, anxiety has none. In anxiety, Heidegger observed, we do not feel threatened by any specific being, but rather by nothing itself. The world does not disappear in anxiety, but it becomes strange, indifferent, meaningless. Things lose their familiar utility and comfort. What emerges in this slippage is not simply the absence of meaning, but the presence of nothing as a phenomenon in its own right. This was not nihilism as Nietzsche had conceived it, not the historical consequence of Christianity's collapse. This was something more disturbing. Heidegger was suggesting that nothing is not a problem to be solved or overcome, but a fundamental structure of human existence. We exist always in relationship to nothing. Our very being, which Heidegger called Dasein, is defined by its awareness of its own finitude, its own eventual not-being. We are the creatures who know we will die, and this knowledge saturates every moment of our existence, whether we acknowledge it or not. But Heidegger's engagement with nothing went deeper than existential psychology. He was making a claim about Western philosophy itself, about what he called the forgetting of being. Since Plato, Heidegger argued, philosophy had concerned itself with beings, particular things, categories of things, the properties and relationships of things. Even metaphysics, which claimed to address ultimate reality, had only ever catalogued and systematized beings. It had never truly asked what it means for anything to be at all. It had confused being with the highest being, whether that was God or the forms or absolute spirit. This confusion, this reduction of being to a being, was what Heidegger meant by metaphysics, and he saw nihilism as its inevitable conclusion. When you reduce being to beings, when you treat existence as merely the sum of existing things, you eventually arrive at a world of pure objectivity, pure calculation, pure resource. Everything becomes material for use, raw material for human projects. Values become preferences. Truth becomes correctness. Even human beings become human resources. This is not accidental decline, but the fulfillment of a trajectory built into Western thought from its origins. Metaphysics, by forgetting being, creates the conditions for nihilism. Heidegger's relationship to Nietzsche was complex and troubled. He spent years lecturing on Nietzsche, producing thousands of pages of interpretation, much of it brilliant, much of it willfully strange. He saw Nietzsche as the culmination of metaphysics, the last metaphysician who pushed the logic of Western philosophy to its limit. The will to power, Heidegger argued, was not an escape from metaphysics but its final expression, the reduction of all being to sheer force, sheer becoming, sheer will. Nietzsche had tried to overcome nihilism, but he had only completed it. This critique revealed something troubling about Heidegger's own position. If nihilism is not merely a cultural crisis but the logical outcome of metaphysics itself, and if Heidegger himself remains bound by language and concepts shaped by that metaphysical tradition, then how can he escape it? Was he diagnosing nihilism from outside, or was he himself caught within it, articulating its most sophisticated form? Heidegger seemed to suggest that escape was not possible through argument or theory, but only through a kind of listening, a receptivity to being that would require abandoning the entire apparatus of Western philosophy. Yet he continued to write philosophy, continued to construct arguments, continued to teach. The question became more pressing given Heidegger's own biography. In 1933, the same philosophical vision that claimed to critique Western metaphysics' reduction of being to calculation led Heidegger into brief but enthusiastic collaboration with National Socialism. He saw in the movement, disastrously and unforgivably, a possible renewal of authentic German existence, a way beyond the technological nihilism of modernity. This was not accidental aberration, but emerged from the same thought that produced being and time. The connection between Heidegger's philosophy and his politics remains one of the most uncomfortable questions in 20th century thought. Can a philosophy that claims to address being itself be so catastrophically wrong about beings, about actual human beings and their dignity and their lives. After the war, Heidegger retreated into increasingly hermetic prose. He wrote about poetry and language, about technology and dwelling, about the gods who have fled and might return. He spoke of Gelassenheit, releasement or letting be, a stance toward existence that neither grasps nor calculates, but simply allows things to be what they are. Whether this represented genuine philosophical development or evasion of responsibility, whether it offered resources for thinking beyond nihilism or merely aestheticized it, remains contested. What is certain is that Heidegger made it impossible to think about nothing naively, impossible to dismiss nihilism as mere negativity or cultural pessimism. He showed that nothing is threaded through existence itself, that we encounter it not only in despair but in wonder, not only in collapse but in openness. His legacy is paradoxical. He gave philosophy language for describing the way meaning can drain from the world, the way beings can lose their being and become mere resources. Yet his own thought seems to oscillate between diagnosis and symptom, between critique of nihilism and participation in it. Perhaps this ambiguity is itself instructive. Perhaps confronting nothing cannot produce certainty, cannot yield a position safely outside the crisis it describes. Perhaps the most rigorous engagement with nihilism must accept its own complicity. While Heidegger pursued the question of being through increasingly obscure prose, other thinkers confronted nihilism more directly, asking not what nothing is, but how human beings should live when confronted by it. While Heidegger pursued the question of being through increasingly obscure prose, other thinkers confronted nihilism more directly, asking not what nothing is, but how human beings should live when confronted by it. The answer, for a generation of philosophers emerging from the devastation of World War II, would not be found in abstract ontology, but in the concrete reality of human existence. If God was truly dead, if meaning was not given, then perhaps human beings had to create it themselves, knowing full well the precariousness of their construction. Jean-Paul Sartre, sitting in Parisian cafes in the 1940s, transformed nihilism from diagnosis into starting point. His famous declaration that existence precedes essence reversed centuries of philosophical tradition. For traditional philosophy, essence came first. A knife has the essence of cutting before any particular knife exists. Human beings have a fixed nature that determines what they are, but Sartre insisted that human beings simply exist first, thrown into the world without instruction manual or predetermined purpose. Only afterward, through choices and actions, do we create whatever essence we might have. This was both an embrace of nihilism's insight and a response to it. Yes, there is no given meaning, no script written by God or nature, but this absence is not paralysis. It is the condition of radical freedom. The burden of this freedom proves heavier than most people can bear. Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, a strange phrase that captures the existential predicament. You did not choose to exist. You did not choose to be thrown into this particular moment in history with these specific circumstances. Yet you must choose constantly what to do and who to become. Every choice shapes your essence, and you cannot escape responsibility by appealing to human nature, to God's will, to social norms, or to any other external authority. The coward who claims he acts from cowardly nature lies to himself. He chose cowardice in each moment and could choose differently. This radical freedom terrifies because it removes all excuses. Sartre called the attempt to escape this freedom bad faith, and he saw it everywhere. The waiter who performs waiterness too perfectly, moving with exaggerated efficiency, becomes a caricature precisely because he tries to be a waiter the way an inkwell is an inkwell, as if his essence were fixed. The anti-Semite who hates Jews because it gives him something solid to be, a ready-made identity requiring no authentic choice. The person who says I had no choice performs a small act of self-deception, because in a world without given meaning, you always have choice. Even refusing to choose is a choice. This sounds harsh, and Sartre meant it to be. He was writing in occupied Paris, surrounded by people who claimed circumstances forced their collaboration, their silence, their complicity. He insisted, you chose that, own it. But if Sartre emphasized freedom, is contemporary Albert Camus focused on absurdity. Camus, who grew up in poverty in Algeria and would die at 46 in a car accident with an unused train ticket in his pocket, believed that Sartre gave human beings too much credit. The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942, opens with one of philosophy's most arresting sentences: "There is only one really serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Everything else, whether the world has 3 dimensions or the mind 9 or 12 categories, comes afterward. The question is whether life is worth living." Camus arrived at this stark formulation through contemplating the absurd, his term for the confrontation between human beings who crave meaning in a universe that offers none. We want reasons, explanations, purposes. We want our lives to matter in some cosmic sense, but the universe remains silent, indifferent to our longing. This mismatch, this divorce between what we desire and what exists, is the absurd. Unlike nihilism, which might simply deny meaning exists, absurdism recognizes that we cannot stop seeking meaning, even when we know we will not find it. The absurd is not in the universe itself, nor in the human mind itself, but in their confrontation. Sisyphus became Camus's hero precisely because his task is meaningless. The gods condemned him to roll a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, then to begin again, forever. No progress, no purpose, no escape. Yet Camus insists we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because once Sisyphus recognizes the absurdity of his task, once he stops hoping the gods will relent or that some higher meaning will emerge, he becomes free. The struggle itself becomes his life. He owns it fully. Each step up the mountain, each moment of effort, becomes his in a way it could not be if he were still hoping for redemption or fearing punishment. He is lucid about his condition, and this lucidity is a kind of victory. This was Camus's answer to suicide. If life is absurd, why not end it? Because that would be escape, and escape is exactly what the absurd forbids. You cannot solve the absurd by eliminating one of its terms. Suicide removes the human being who confronts meaninglessness, but it does not address meaninglessness itself. The authentic response is revolt, to live fully while recognizing that life is not justified by any external meaning, to be Sisyphus, conscious and unreconciled, pushing the boulder not because it matters in some ultimate sense, but because it is what you do, what you choose to do, what makes this absurd existence yours. Both Sartre and Camus transformed nihilism from endpoint to starting point. They accepted that there is no given meaning, no cosmic justification, no essential human nature that tells us how to live, but they refused despair. For Sartre, the absence of essence means we are radically free to create ourselves through our choices. For Camus, the absence of meaning makes authentic engagement possible because we act without the false hope of cosmic validation. Both thinkers insisted that recognizing meaninglessness does not paralyze action, but grounds it differently. We act not because our actions are justified by something outside them, but because we are beings who act, who must act, who through action create whatever significance our lives might have. This transformation of nihilism into a ground for authentic action rather than despair represents one of existentialism's central achievements. It acknowledged what Nietzsche had diagnosed but refused to treat it as catastrophe. The death of God, the absence of given values, the collapse of metaphysical certainty, these were not endings but clearings. With the debris of false certainties removed, human beings could finally take responsibility for their own existence. The void was not something to fill with new certainties, but something to inhabit consciously, creating meaning through engagement rather than discovering it through revelation. Yet not everyone believed that heroic defiance or radical freedom could adequately address the abyss. Some thinkers embraced nihilism more completely, finding in negation itself a kind of terrible honesty. Yet not everyone believed that heroic defiance or radical freedom could adequately address the abyss. Some thinkers embraced nihilism more completely, finding in negation itself a kind of terrible honesty. But here something unexpected happened. In the hands of certain writers and philosophers, nihilism ceased to be merely a position to defend or refute. and became instead a style, an aesthetic, a way of arranging words on a page that enacted the very emptiness it described. The question was no longer whether meaning exists, but whether the absence of meaning could itself be beautiful. Emil Cioran understood this possibility better than almost anyone. Born in Romania in 1911, Cioran spent his early years in an almost operatic despair, writing feverish, ecstatic prose about insomnia, suicide, and the fundamental absurdity of being born. When he moved to Paris in 1937, he made a curious decision. He would abandon his native Romanian and write exclusively in French. The language change forced a transformation in his prose. The wild, uncontrolled energy of his youth hardened into something sharper, more controlled. He became a master of the aphorism, the short, brutal statement that carries the weight of an entire philosophy in a single line. Cioran's books read like collections of elegant wounds. A Short History of Decay, published in 1949, offers not arguments but observations, fragments, confessions. He celebrates failure not as unfortunate, but as the only honest human posture. Success, achievement, progress, all the things human beings supposedly value, he sees as forms of delusion, ways of lying to ourselves about what we are. We are, in his view, beings who should never have been born, and the best we can do is acknowledge this with style and clarity. There is something almost perverse in how beautiful he makes despair sound. It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late, he writes, and the sentence has the precise construction of a geometric proof. What makes Cioran more than simply a pessimist is his complete lack of moral judgment about the void. He does not rage against meaninglessness or mourn the absence of God. He settles into emptiness the way another person might settle into a comfortable chair. His nihilism is aesthetic before it is philosophical. He is not trying to convince you of a proposition. He is showing you how a certain kind of consciousness arranges itself when it stops pretending. The aphorism becomes the perfect form for this project because it refuses system, refuses connection, refuses the kind of argumentative structure that implies there is something to be built or defended. Each sentence stands alone, complete, without justification. Samuel Beckett pursued a similar project through different means. Born in Dublin in 1906, Beckett spent decades stripping away everything unnecessary from his work until almost nothing remained. His early novels are dense and difficult, full of references and verbal play, but after the Second World War, something changed. He began writing in French, like Cioran, and the language shift forced a new austerity. Waiting for Godot, written in 1948 and 49, presents two men waiting for someone who never arrives, doing almost nothing, saying almost nothing of consequence, and yet somehow filling an entire evening of theatre with their nothingness. The play is sometimes described as absurdist, and it shares certain features with Camus's philosophy of the absurd. But Beckett goes further. He is not interested in rebellion or defiance or even in the question of suicide. He simply presents waiting itself, existence itself, stripped of purpose or progress. Vladimir and Estragon wait because that is what they do. They cannot remember why they are waiting, or what Godot promised them, or even if they are in the right place. The play enacts meaninglessness so thoroughly that it becomes hypnotic. Nothing happens, twice, and somehow this nothingness holds attention more completely than most carefully plotted dramas. Beckett's later work becomes even more minimal. In plays like Not I, a single mouth speaks in the darkness, fragments of sentences pouring out without clear reference or connection. In Breath, a 30-second piece from 1969, the stage is empty except for rubbish, and all that happens is an inhalation, a cry, and an exhalation. No actors, no words, barely any time, and yet it is a complete work, saying everything Beckett needs to say about the arc of human life. You are born, you cry, you die, and what remains is trash. He does not need to argue for this vision. He simply shows it, and the showing is enough. What Beckett and Cioran share is a refusal of consolation. They will not tell you that suffering has meaning, or that struggle is ennobling, or that despair can be overcome through authentic choice. They offer no exit, no solution, no redemption. And yet their work is not depressing in the way you might expect. There is something clarifying about such uncompromising negation. It is as if they have removed all the comforting lies, and in doing so revealed a kind of cold beauty in the bare structure that remains. Thomas Ligotti, a contemporary American writer born in 1953, extends this aesthetic into horror fiction. His stories describe worlds where consciousness itself is a mistake, where awareness is a cosmic error that traps beings in suffering for no reason and with no escape. But Ligotti is not simply writing scary stories, he is using the conventions of horror, the mood and atmosphere and narrative structures, to literalize nihilistic philosophy. His characters discover that reality is a nightmare from which there is no waking, that meaning is a delusion we construct to avoid facing the truth of our condition. The horror comes not from monsters or violence, but from recognition. The terrible thing is understanding what you are and where you are, and that there is nothing to be done about it. In his non-fiction book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, published in 2010, Ligotti makes his philosophical position explicit. He argues for what he calls pessimistic nihilism, the view that consciousness is a catastrophe and that the kindest thing that could happen would be for life to cease reproducing itself. He draws on Schopenhauer, on Schoran, on Zipf's theory that human consciousness is an evolutionary mistake. But what makes the book strange is that it is also deeply literary. Ligotti cares as much about how ideas sound as whether they are true. The prose has rhythm and texture. The arguments unfold with the pacing of a ghost story. This raises a genuine philosophical puzzle. Can you express nihilism aesthetically without undermining it? If you make despair beautiful, have you not given it value, and therefore contradicted the very claim you are making? If Schoran writes sentences of crystalline perfection about the worthlessness of existence, does the perfection of the sentence redeem the worthlessness? If Beckett creates plays of devastating emptiness that audiences find profound and moving, has he not created meaning from meaninglessness? Perhaps the distinction lies between philosophical nihilism and aesthetic nihilism. Philosophical nihilism makes claims about reality, about what exists or does not exist, about whether values are objective or illusory. Aesthetic nihilism is something different. It is a way of seeing, a sensibility, a style. It does not argue that beauty does not exist. It finds beauty in negation, in absence, in the acceptance of emptiness. The aesthetic nihilist says, yes, there is no meaning, and look how precisely I can show you that lack of meaning. The precision itself becomes a kind of achievement, even if it is an achievement that points only toward nothing. Or perhaps the expressions of nihilism do undermine the position itself. Perhaps you cannot write about meaninglessness without creating meaning through the act of writing. Perhaps every carefully constructed sentence about the futility of construction performs its own refutation. Schoran spent decades polishing aphorisms about how nothing matters. That seems like something that mattered to him. Beckett revised his plays obsessively, seeking exactly the right words to express the impossibility of right words. Ligotti crafted stories with meticulous prose about the horror of crafting anything. There is a paradox here, and it may be that aesthetic nihilism lives in that paradox rather than resolving it. These artistic and philosophical explorations raise an uncomfortable question. Can nihilism be lived, or does it inevitably collapse into contradiction? The most rigorous nihilists have offered surprising answers. When aesthetic explorations of meaninglessness become a kind of performance, the question shifts from whether life has meaning to whether our actions do. This is where nihilism becomes most personal, most difficult, and most urgent. Not in grand cosmic voids, but in the immediate problem of how to act, what to do, whether anything matters enough to choose one path over another. Moral nihilism asks the hardest question. If there is no God, no transcendent order, no objective ground for values, then what becomes of right and wrong? And more importantly, what becomes of us? The problem divides immediately. Descriptive moral nihilism makes a factual claim about the world. There are no objective moral properties, no moral facts independent of human minds and cultures. Prescriptive moral nihilism goes further, claiming that because there are no objective moral facts, we have no reason to follow any particular moral system at all. The first is a metaphysical position, the second a practical one. The first says morality is not built into the fabric of reality. The second says this recognition should change how we live. This distinction matters enormously. You can accept descriptive moral nihilism without chaos, without cruelty, without anything goes. You can believe that moral values are human constructions and still consider those constructions binding, meaningful, worthy of devotion. But prescriptive moral nihilism pulls at something deeper, asking why we should honor any constraint if constraints themselves are invented. If murder is not wrong in the way that 2 + 2 = 4, if it is wrong only because humans decided to call it wrong, then what authority does that wrongness possess? Error theory, developed most rigorously by philosopher J.L. Mackie in the 20th century, offers one answer. Error theory claims that when we make moral judgments, we are systematically mistaken. When someone says murder is wrong, they are not expressing a preference or describing a social convention. They are making a claim about objective moral reality. But objective moral reality does not exist. Therefore, all positive moral judgments are false. Not meaningless, not subjective, but actually false. The way claiming that the earth is flat is false. The structure of this argument is strange and uncomfortable. It grants that moral language functions as if it refers to objective facts, then insists those facts are not there. We speak as if rightness and wrongness are properties that actions possess independently of our attitudes toward them. We feel moral obligations as external demands, not personal choices. But this feeling, this linguistic structure, this phenomenology of obligation, all of it points to something that does not exist. We are, in the language of error theory, projecting properties onto the world that the world does not contain. Nietzsche approached the problem differently. His famous phrase, revaluation of all values, is often misunderstood as simple rejection, a call to throw away morality and embrace selfishness or chaos. But Nietzsche was not rejecting value as such. He was rejecting specific value systems, particularly Christian morality, which he saw as life-denying, resentful, and based on fictions about divine authority and cosmic justice. His project was not to live without values, but to create new ones. Values grounded in life affirmation, strength, creativity, rather than in guilt, self-denial, and imaginary afterlives. This distinction is crucial. Nietzsche saw that most people who lost faith in Christian morality continued to live by its values anyway, simply without the theological justification. They remained committed to altruism, humility, equality, but could no longer explain why. This, for Nietzsche, was incomplete nihilism, the worst kind. They had killed God but kept his shadow. True overcoming would require inventing new values altogether, values that did not depend on fictions about the soul, sin, or salvation. This is not moral nihilism in the sense of believing morality is impossible. It is moral nihilism in the sense of recognizing that inherited morality has collapsed and something new must be built. The relationship between moral nihilism and relativism is often confused. Relativism claims that moral truths are relative to cultures, individuals, or frameworks. What is right for one society may be wrong for another, and there is no external standard by which to judge between them. Moral nihilism, by contrast, denies that there are moral truths at all, relative or otherwise. Relativism still believes in rightness and wrongness, just indexed to particular contexts. Nihilism rejects the categories entirely, or at least rejects the idea that they refer to anything beyond human invention. Yet, even here, nuance matters. Some forms of relativism slide toward nihilism when they insist that moral claims are nothing more than expressions of cultural preference, no more binding than tastes in food or fashion. If calling something wrong means only my culture disapproves, then the force of moral obligation starts to dissolve. Why should cultural disapproval obligate me if I do not share that culture's assumptions? The relativist might answer that you should honor the norms of your culture because you are part of it, because social cohesion requires it. But this answer appeals to practical consequences, not to moral truth. It is a step toward pragmatism, perhaps, but also a step toward acknowledging that morality is a kind of useful fiction. The most troubling question remains: does moral nihilism lead to anything goes? Does recognizing that morality is not objective free us to act however we wish? The worry is ancient. Dostoevsky's Ivan Karamazov famously suggests that if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. Without divine authority, without cosmic justice, without a transcendent lawgiver, what constraint remains? But this worry may rest on a misunderstanding of where moral constraint actually comes from. Even if moral facts do not exist in some platonic heaven, even if rightness is not woven into the universe, moral constraint can still arise from other sources, from empathy, from social agreements, from the recognition that we are interdependent beings who flourish or suffer together, from the simple fact that we care about things, that we are not indifferent to pain, cruelty, beauty, kindness. These are not objective moral facts in the metaphysical sense, but they are real features of human life. They can ground constraint without grounding cosmic truth. Some moral nihilists have argued that recognizing the constructed nature of morality can actually produce better moral systems. If we understand that we are the authors of our values, we might choose them more carefully, revise them more readily, hold them with less dogmatism. We might abandon values that cause unnecessary suffering simply because tradition handed them down. We might invent new values for new circumstances, rather than pretending that ancient texts or intuitions provide timeless answers. Whether this optimism is justified remains an open question. History offers no shortage of examples where the collapse of moral certainty led not to careful reconstruction but to brutality, to the rise of ideologies that recognized no limits, because they recognized no transcendent goods. The 20th century demonstrated with terrible clarity that moral nihilism can be weaponized, that the claim that nothing matters can justify atrocity as easily as it justifies compassion. And yet perhaps the real danger is not moral nihilism itself, but the way it is wielded. The recognition that morality is not cosmically ordained does not by itself tell you what to do. It clears space, removes false justifications, forces honesty about the sources of our values. What we build in that space remains a human choice, made not in obedience to divine command or metaphysical necessity, but in acknowledgement of who we are and who we wish to become. If nihilism dismantles moral certainty, it also raises questions about knowledge itself. Can we know anything if there is no stable ground? The epistemological dimension of nihilism proves just as destabilizing as the moral. If values crumble and morality loses its foundation, knowledge itself cannot remain untouched. The same forces that undermine ethical certainty also destabilize the ground on which we claim to know anything at all. Epistemological nihilism asks whether truth exists, whether knowledge is possible, and whether the entire edifice of human understanding rests on nothing more solid than convenient illusion. This is not the familiar skepticism of ancient philosophy, which merely suspended judgment while waiting for better evidence. This is something more radical, the suggestion that truth itself might be a category mistake, a relic of metaphysical thinking that dissolves under scrutiny. The distinction matters more than it first appears. The ancient skeptics, from Pyrrho to Sextus Empiricus, cultivated a discipline of withholding assent. They pointed to the equal weight of opposing arguments, the variability of perception, the unreliability of reasoning, and concluded that the wise course was to refrain from making definitive claims. But skepticism in this classical mode never denied that truth existed somewhere, waiting to be found. It simply doubted whether human beings possessed the tools to grasp it with certainty. Epistemological nihilism goes further. It suggests that the very concept of truth, of correspondence between thought and reality, may be incoherent. There is nothing waiting to be found because the category of foundational truth is itself a construction, a way of speaking inherited from traditions that no longer hold authority. This position emerges most clearly in postmodern thought, though its roots run deeper through Nietzsche's perspectivism and the pragmatist tradition. Jean-François Lyotard defined the postmodern condition as incredulity toward meta-narratives, those grand explanatory frameworks that claim to reveal universal truths about history, progress, reason, or human nature. The Enlightenment story of rational advancement, the Marxist dialectic of historical materialism, the Christian arc of fall and redemption, all these become suspect not because they are factually wrong in this detail or that, but because they claim a God's eye view that no finite situated observer can possibly occupy. Every claim to truth on this account emerges from particular contexts, power relations and linguistic structures that shape what counts as knowledge in the first place. Truth is not discovered but produced, and what gets produced depends on who has the authority to make such productions stick. Michel Foucault traced how regimes of truth operate in history, showing how what counts as knowledge in one era, psychiatry or medicine or criminology, serves specific institutional and political functions. Knowledge and power are not opposites but intertwined, each reinforcing the other. This does not mean that Foucault believed nothing could be known or that all claims are equally valid. It means that claims to universal objective truth often mask particular interests and should be examined for what they enable and what they exclude. But critics have pointed out that this position teeters on the edge of self-contradiction. If all truth claims are products of power relations and linguistic structures, what about that claim itself? Does Foucault occupy some privileged position outside the systems he describes, able to see their operations clearly while everyone else remains trapped? Or is his analysis just one more discourse among many, neither more nor less true than the regimes he critiques? This is the performative contradiction problem, and it haunts epistemological nihilism at every turn. To assert that there is no truth is to make a truth claim. To argue that all perspectives are equally valid is to privilege that perspective above others. To say that knowledge is impossible is to claim knowledge of that impossibility. The Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein gestured at this problem in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, concluding that anything truly important lies beyond what can be said. His famous final proposition suggested that anyone who understood his arguments would recognize them as nonsensical and throw away the ladder after climbing it. But this mystical solution hardly resolves the tension. If epistemological nihilism is correct, it seems to undermine its own grounds for being stated. If it is not correct, then truth claims remain possible and nihilism fails. Either way, the position appears to collapse. Pragmatists offered a different response, one that tried to sidestep rather than solve the contradiction. William James and later Richard Rorty suggested that the whole problem rests on a mistake about what truth means. Instead of asking whether our beliefs correspond to some independent reality, we should ask whether they work, whether they help us navigate experience, solve problems, and coordinate action with others. Truth on this account is not a matter of mirroring the world, but of coping with it successfully. A belief is true if it proves useful over time, if it helps rather than hinders. This does not mean that anything goes, or that truth is merely subjective. Some beliefs work better than others, and the test is pragmatic engagement with a world that pushes back against our expectations. But it does mean that we can abandon the search for foundations, for certainty, for knowledge guaranteed by something beyond human practice. This pragmatist move has been both influential and controversial. It seems to preserve the possibility of distinguishing better from worse beliefs, without requiring the kind of absolute foundation that epistemological nihilism denies. But critics argue that it merely relocates the problem rather than resolving it. What counts as working? What makes one outcome better than another? Any answer to these questions seems to presuppose values and standards that cannot themselves be justified pragmatically without circularity. If we say a belief is true because it leads to survival, we assume survival is worth pursuing. If we say it is true because it produces happiness, we assume happiness is the goal. But nihilism questions precisely these kinds of assumptions. The pragmatist has not escaped the void, but only furnished it more comfortably. Perhaps the deepest question is whether epistemological nihilism represents an incoherent dead end, or the opening of genuinely new philosophical space. Some contemporary philosophers argue that we can embrace fatalism, the recognition that all our beliefs are provisional and subject to revision without collapsing into nihilism. We can acknowledge that knowledge is always situated, partial, and shaped by human interests, while still maintaining that some claims are better supported than others, some methods more reliable, some beliefs more justified. This is not the absolute certainty that traditional epistemology sought, but it may be all that finite beings embedded in history and culture can reasonably hope for. The alternative is to insist that if we cannot have perfect knowledge, we have no knowledge at all. But that strikes many as too hasty, a false dichotomy that mistakes the absence of foundations for the absence of ground. Yet the nihilist might respond that this middle position merely postpones the reckoning. Fatalism still assumes there is something to be fallible about, some reality our beliefs approximate more or less successfully. It still treats truth as a regulative ideal, even if we never fully achieve it. And that assumption, the nihilist insists, is precisely what stands in need of justification. We have inherited a language of truth, knowledge, and justification from metaphysical traditions that claimed to ground these concepts in God, reason, or nature. When those foundations erode, the concepts built upon them do not simply float free, slightly less certain than before, they lose their coherence entirely. What remains is not cautious epistemology, but the recognition that knowledge was always a kind of useful fiction, a way of talking that served certain purposes but should not be mistaken for insight into how things really are. These theoretical puzzles might seem abstract, but they lead to the most pressing question: what does nihilism mean for how we actually live? Does it demand anything of us, or does it release us into pure contingency? These theoretical puzzles might seem abstract, but they lead to the most pressing question: what does nihilism mean for how we actually live? Does it demand anything of us, or does it release us into pure contingency? There is a difference, crucial and often overlooked, between nihilism as diagnosis and nihilism as lifestyle. The diagnosis describes a condition, the collapse of transcendent meaning, the absence of cosmic purpose, the recognition that values are human constructions rather than universal truths. This is an observation about the world we inhabit, post-Enlightenment, post-Darwin, post-Nietzsche. It names something real about contemporary existence, something felt by anyone who has looked carefully at the foundations of their beliefs and found them suspended over nothing. But nihilism as lifestyle is something else entirely. It is the decision to live in a particular relationship to meaninglessness, to adopt negation as posture, to refuse engagement with the world on the grounds that engagement itself is futile. This often manifests as a kind of performative despair, a cultivation of emptiness as identity. The person who shrugs at every value, who meets every proposal with "what does it matter," who treats detachment as wisdom, this person has turned diagnosis into costume. The distinction matters because the first is unavoidable for anyone paying attention, while the second is a choice, and often a bad one. Recognizing that the universe provides no inherent meaning does not require treating all meanings as equally worthless. It does not mandate passivity or cynicism. In fact, it might demand the opposite. This has given rise to what some call optimistic nihilism, though the term itself sounds like contradiction. The idea is simple: if nothing matters objectively, then everything that matters does so because we decide it matters. This is not relativism dressed up as philosophy. It is the recognition that human meaning-making is real and consequential precisely because it emerges from our engagement with the world, our relationships with each other, our projects and commitments. The absence of cosmic endorsement does not diminish these meanings, it clarifies them. Consider the person who works to reduce suffering, knowing there is no universal imperative to do so. Their work does not become pointless in the absence of divine command or natural law. It becomes more remarkable because it emerges from choice rather than obligation. The meaning is constructed, yes, but construction is not the same as fiction. A bridge is constructed. It is no less real for that. This raises an uncomfortable question that nihilism has never adequately addressed: whether the condition it diagnoses is culturally specific or philosophically universal. Nietzsche certainly thought nihilism was the destiny of European civilization in particular, the consequence of Christianity eating itself through its own commitment to truth. The will to truth, he argued, eventually turns against the religious framework that cultivated it, revealing that framework as yet another human construction. This is a historical event, not a timeless philosophical necessity. Other cultures, not shaped by the particular trajectory of Christian metaphysics giving way to scientific rationality, might not experience this crisis of meaning at all. Buddhist philosophy, for instance, begins from premises that Western philosophers label nihilistic, the denial of inherent essence, the recognition of emptiness, and yet Buddhist practice does not collapse into despair or paralysis. It offers paths, practices, ethical frameworks. The nothing is approached differently when it is starting point rather than traumatic revelation. This suggests that nihilism, at least in its most anguished forms, might be a specifically Western philosophical disease, the hangover after the intoxication of absolutes. Other traditions that never placed meaning outside the human world, that never imagined a cosmic order endorsing human values, developed different relationships to existence without foundation. They constructed meanings without first needing to demolish transcendent ones. Contemporary academic philosophy has an ambivalent relationship with nihilism. Some departments avoid it entirely, treating it as adolescent posturing rather than serious inquiry. Others engage it through technical analysis of metaethics or epistemology, defanging it through precision. Still others attempt to transcend it by proposing new grounds for value, naturalistic ethics, evolutionary explanations for moral intuition, pragmatic justifications for belief. But there is also a strand of contemporary thought that embraces nihilism more completely, not as tragedy, but as liberation. If there are no predetermined purposes, then we are free to create purposes. If there is no human nature that dictates how we should live, then we can experiment with forms of life. This is nihilism turned generative, emptiness as possibility rather than lack. The question becomes, what does meaning construction require? Not discovery, because there is nothing out there to discover. Not invention from nothing, because we are always already embedded in history, culture, language, relationships. Something between these poles, meaning emerges from engagement, from commitment, from the accumulated weight of choices and connections. It is not arbitrary, because we are not isolated individuals projecting fantasies onto blank reality. We are social beings, shaped by and shaping the communities we inhabit. This means that living with nihilism involves a certain discipline. It requires distinguishing between the recognition that meanings are constructed and the lazy conclusion that all constructions are equal. Some meanings sustain human flourishing, others corrode it. Some create conditions for continued meaning-making, others foreclose possibilities. The absence of cosmic validation does not eliminate the need for judgment, care, discernment. Perhaps the most honest response to nihilism is neither despair nor heroic defiance, but something closer to humility. We build meanings knowing they are fragile, knowing they could have been otherwise, knowing that future generations might look back at what we valued with incomprehension or pity. We commit to projects, relationships, principles, not because the universe endorses them, but because we must act, must choose, must orient ourselves somehow in the world we find ourselves thrown into. Nihilism reveals that we have been doing this all along. Every value we inherited was itself constructed by people facing meaninglessness, building what they could with the materials available. The ground has always been groundless. We have always been suspended over the void, creating structures that hold us temporarily together.